Signalman by Charles Dickens. "Hello, below there!" He was standing at the door of his post, instead of looking up to where I stood on top of the steep cutting over his head. He turned himself about and looked down the tracks. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so. Then, raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. Just then, there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation, and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back as though this rapid train had forced to draw me down. I found a zigzag descending path which I followed. When it came down low enough to see him again, he was standing between the rails by which the train had passed. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped a moment. He was a dark, sallow man, with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as ever I saw. On either side, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone. A gloomy red light near the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. There was something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light, near the tunnel's mouth, as if something were missing from it. And then he looked at me. "You look at me," I said, forcing a smile, "as if you had a dread of me." "I was doubtful," he returned, "whether I had seen you before." "Where?" He pointed to the red light he had looked at. "My good fellow, I never was there, you may swear." "Yes, I am sure I may." He had enough responsibility to bear, but exactness and watchfulness were what was required of him. To change that signal and to turn this iron handle now and then, he took me into his box where there was a fire, a desk for an official book in which he had to make certain entries, and a telegraphic instrument. In the discharge of his duties, I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant. But while he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a fallen color, opened the door of the hut, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel.
"I am troubled, sir."
"With what? What is your trouble?"
"It is very difficult to me to impart, sir, but I took you for someone else. That troubles me."
"That mistake?"
"No, that someone else."
"Who is it?"
"I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved, violently waved. This way. One moonlit night, I was sitting here, when I heard a voice cry, 'Hello, below there! For God's sake, clear the way!' I saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving. The voice seemed hoarse with shouting. I caught up my lamp and ran toward the figure, calling, 'What's wrong? What has happened?' It just stood outside the blackness of the tunnel. I ran up at it. Then it was gone."
"Into the tunnel?" said I.
"No. I ran on into the tunnel, 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head and saw the wet stains stealing down the walls. I ran out again, faster than I had run in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of the place upon me. And back here, I telegraphed, 'An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong?' The answer came back, 'All well.'" Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out my spine, I showed him how this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight. And as to imaginary cry, do but listen for a moment to the wind in this unnatural valley, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires." "That's all very well,"
he muttered, after we had sat listening for a while. But he would beg to remark that he had not finished. I asked his pardon.
Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident on this line happened. And within 10 hours, the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood.
A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. It was not to be denied that this was a remarkable coincidence, but it was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and they must be taken into account in dealing with such a subject. He again begged to remark that he had not finished. I again begged his pardon for being betrayed into interruptions.
This was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I had recovered from the surprise and shock when one morning I looked towards the red light and saw the spectre again. That very day, as a train came out of the tunnel, I noticed at a carriage window on my side what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver. He put his brake on, and I heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments and was brought in here and laid down on this floor between us.
Involuntarily, I pushed my chair back as I looked from the boards at which he pointed to himself.
Now, sir, mark this and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since it has been there now and again at the danger light. I have no peace or rest for it. It calls out to me in an agonized manner, "Below there! Look out!" By this time, you will fully understand, sir, that what troubles me so dreadfully is what is the spectre warning against. There is danger overhanging somewhere on the line. It is not to be doubted this third time. But surely, this is a cruel haunting of me. If I telegraph danger, I can give no reason for it. This is the way it would work. A message, danger, take care. Answer, what danger, where? Message, don't know, but for God's sake, take care. They would displace me. What else could they do? When it first stood under the danger light, why not tell me where that accident was to happen, if it must happen? Why not tell me how it could be averted, if it could have been averted? When on its second coming, why not tell me she is going to die? Let them keep her at home. If it came on those 2 occasions only to show me that its warnings were true, and so to prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now? And I, a mere poor signalman on this solitary station, why not go to somebody with credit to be believed and power to act? I saw that for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, I had to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality, I represented to him that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advanced began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 a.m. That I more than once looked back at the red light as I ascended the pathway, and that I did not like the red light, I see no reason to conceal, nor did I like the 2 sequences of the accident and the dead girl. I see no reason to conceal that either. I had appointed to return accordingly. Next evening I walked out early and looked down from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when, close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man. The danger light was not yet lighted. I descended the path with all the speed I could. "What is the matter?" I asked. "Signalman killed this morning, sir,"
Not the man belonging to that box,
You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him,
said the man, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end of the tarp.
for his face is quite composed.
How did this happen?
He was cut down by the engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better. But somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. As the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her, and she cut him down. There was no time to check speed, and I knew him to be very careful. As he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle, I shut it off and called to him as loud as I could call, "Below there! For God's sake, clear the way!" I put this arm before my eyes, and not to see, and waved this arm to the last. But it was no use.
Without prolonging the narrative, I may, in closing, point out the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the gesticulation he had imitated.
Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. For an evil errand he dare not explain, young Goodman Brown has left Faith, his pretty wife of 3 months, alone for the night in their village of Salem. Remembering the pink ribbons of her cap playing in the wind, he journeys along a dreary road darkened by the gloomiest trees of the forest. Another man in grave and decent attire joins him to walk side by side. "You are late, Goodman Brown." "Faith kept me back a while." It was now deep dusk in the forest. The second traveler was about 50 years old, but the only thing about him that could be fixed upon as remarkable was his staff, which bore the likeness of a great black snake. "Come, Goodman Brown, take my staff if you are so soon weary. Friend, having met thee here, it is my purpose now to return whence I came." "Sayest thou so? Let us walk on. We are but a little way in the forest yet." "Too far, too far. My father never went into the woods on such an errand, nor his father before him. We have been a race of good Christians, and shall I be the first of the name of Brown that ever took this path and kept such company, thou wouldst say? I helped your grandfather, the constable, when he lashed the Quaker woman so smartly through the streets of Salem. And it was I that brought your father a pitch pine knot to set fire to an Indian village in King Philip's War. They were my good friends, both, and I would fain be friends with you for their sake. I marvel they never spoke of these matters. We are a people of prayer and abide no such wickedness." "Well, wickedness or not, I have a very general acquaintance here in New England. The deacons of many a church, a majority of the great and general court, the governor." "Can this be so? Were I to go on with thee, how should I meet the eye of that good old man, our minister at Salem village? Oh, his voice would make me tremble." Well, go on. Goodman Brown, go on. But prithee, don't kill me with laughing." "Well, then, to end the matter at once, there is my wife, Faith. It would break her dear little heart, and I'd rather break my own." "Nay, if that be the case, e'en go thy ways, Goodman Brown. I would not for 20 old women like the one hobbling before us that Faith should come to any harm." He pointed his staff at a female figure on the path in whom Goodman Brown recognized a very pious and exemplary dame who had taught him his catechism in youth. A marvel truly that Goody Cloyce should be so far in the wilderness at nightfall. But with your leave, friend, I shall take a cut through the woods. Being a stranger to you, she might ask whom I was consorting with and whither I was going." "Be it so. Betake you to the woods, and let me keep the path." The young man turned aside, but took care to watch his companion, who advanced softly along the road. The traveler put forth his staff. and touched her withered neck with what seemed the serpent's tail. "The devil!" cried the pious old woman. Then Goody Close knows her old friend. "Ah, forsooth, and it is your worship indeed. Yea, truly it is. But would your worship believe it? My broomstick hath strangely disappeared, stolen, I suspect, by that unhanged witch Goody Cory. So with no broom to ride on, I made my mind up to foot it. But lend me your arm, and we shall be there in a twinkling." "I may not spare you my arm, Goody Cloyse, but here is my staff, if you will." And so saying, he threw it down at her feet, where it assumed life, being one of the rods which its owner had formerly lent to the Egyptian Magi. Where Goodman Brown now looked, he beheld neither Goody Cloyse nor the serpentine staff, but his fellow traveler alone. That old woman, she taught me my catechism." They continued to walk onward. The elder traveler plucked a branch of maple to serve for a walking stick, and thus the pair proceeded until in a gloomy hollow of the road Goodman Brown refused to go any farther. "My mind is made up. What if a wretched old woman do choose to go to the devil? Is that any reason why I should quit my dear faith and go after her?" "Sit here and rest yourself a while, and when you feel like moving again, there is my staff to help you along." And he threw his companion the maple stick and was speedily out of sight. Goodman Brown heard the tramp of horses and deemed it advisable to conceal himself within the verge of the forest. On came the hoof tramps and the voices of the riders. It vexed him the more because he could have sworn that he recognized the voices of the minister and Deacon Gookin. And the voice, like the deacon's, said, "They tell me that some of our community are to be here from Falmouth and beyond. Moreover, there's a goodly young woman to be taken into communion." Replied the minister, "Spur up, or we shall be late." The hooves clattered again, and the voices passed on through the forest. Young Goodman Brown caught hold of a tree for support, being ready to sink down on the ground. He looked up to the sky. "With heaven above and faith below, I will yet stand firm against the devil." Then there came a confused sound of voices. He could distinguish townspeople of his own, men and women, both pious and ungodly. There was one voice of a young woman entreating for some favor, and all the unseen multitude, both saints and sinners, seemed to encourage her onward. "Faith!" There was a scream. Something fluttered lightly down through the air and caught on a branch of a tree. The young man seized it and beheld a pink ribbon. "My faith is gone. There is no good on earth. Come, devil, for to thee this world is given." And maddened with despair, Goodman Brown set forth again, and he seemed to fly along the forest path. He saw a red light and heard the swell of what seemed to him. It was a familiar one in the choir of the village meeting house. The verse died away and was lengthened by a chorus. At one extremity of an open space arose a rock surrounded by 4 blazing pines, their tops aflame, their stems untouched, like candles. As the red light rose and fell, a numerous congregation alternately shone forth and then disappeared in the shadows. Among them appeared faces that would be seen the next day, church members of the Salem village, and men of dissolute lives and women of spotted fame. Another verse of the hymn arose, with words which expressed all that our nature can conceive of sin. And with the final peal of that dreadful anthem, there now appeared a figure. "Bring forth the converts." Goodman Brown stepped forward from the shadow of the trees. Thither came also the slender form of a veiled female. "Welcome, my children, to the communion of your race. My children, look behind you." They turned, and flashing forth in a sheet of flame, the fiend worshippers were seen. "There are all whom ye have reverenced from youth. This night it shall be granted you to know their secret deeds, how elders of the church have whispered wanton words to the young maids, how many a woman eager for widow's weeds has given her husband a drink at bedtime and let him sleep his last sleep. Far more than this, it shall be yours to penetrate the deep mystery of sin. And now, my children, look upon each other. They did so, and by the blaze of the hell-kindled torches, the wretched man beheld his faith, and the wife her husband, trembling before that unhallowed altar. Lo, there ye stand, my children. Evil must be your only happiness. And there they stood, the only pair, as it seemed, who were yet hesitating on the verge of wickedness in this dark world. The husband cast one look at his pale wife, and Faith at him. Faith, Faith, look up to heaven and resist the wicked one! Whether Faith obeyed, he knew not. Hardly had he spoken when he found himself amid calm night and solitude. The next morning, young Goodman Brown came slowly into the street of Salem village. The good minister was taking a walk and bestowing a blessing. Old Deacon Gookin was at a domestic worship. Goody Cloyce stood catechizing a little girl. He spied the head of Faith with the pink ribbons, and bursting into such joy at the sight of him, she skipped along the street. But Goodman Brown passed on without a greeting. Had Goodman Brown fallen asleep in the forest and only dreamed a wild dream of a witch meeting? Be it so, if you will. A stern, a sad, a distrustful, if not a desperate man did he become. On the Sabbath day, when the congregation were singing, he could not listen. When the minister spoke from the pulpit, Goodman Brown turned pale. And when the family knelt down at prayer, he scowled and muttered to himself and gazed sternly at his wife and turned away. And when he had lived long and had borne to his grave a hoary corpse followed by Faith, an aged woman, and children and grandchildren, they carved no hopeful verse upon his tombstone, for his dying hour was gloom.
The Flowering of the Strange Orchid by H.G. Wells. The buying of orchids always has in it a certain speculative flavor. You have before you the brown shriveled lump of tissue, and for the rest you must trust your judgment or your good luck. The plant may be moribund or dead, or it may be just a respectable purchase, or perhaps there slowly unfolds before the delighted eyes of the happy purchaser, day after day, some new variety, some novel richness. Pride, beauty, and profit blossom together on one delicate green spike, and it may be even immortality. It was perhaps the hope of some happy discovery that made Winter Wedderburn such a frequent attendant at orchid sales. He was a shy, lonely, rather ineffectual man, provided with just enough income to keep off the spur of necessity, and as it happened, he grew orchids in his ambitious little hothouse. "I have a fancy," he said over his coffee, "that something is going to happen to me today." "Oh, don't say that," said his housekeeper. "Oh, you misunderstand me. I mean nothing unpleasant, though what I do mean, I scarcely know. Today, Peters are going to sell a batch of plants from the Andamans and the Indies. I shall go up to London and see what they have. It may be I shall buy something good unawares. That may be it. Are those the things collected by that poor young fellow, Batten, you told me of the other day?" "Yes." "Nothing ever happens to me. I wonder why. Things enough happen to other people. When I was a little boy, I never had accidents. I never fell in love as I grew up, never married. I wonder how it feels to have something happen to you, something really remarkable. That orchid collector was only 36 when he died, and he'd been married twice and divorced once. He'd had malarial fever 4 times, and once he broke his thigh. Once he was wounded by a poisoned dart, and in the end he was killed by jungle leeches. It must have all been very troublesome, but then it must have been very interesting, you know, except perhaps the leeches. I'm sure it was not good for him. When he returned from London, he was in a state of mild excitement. He had made a purchase. The orchids were laid out on a spotless tablecloth before him. I knew something would happen today, and I have bought all these. Some of them, I feel, will be remarkable. That one, he pointed to a shriveled rhizome, was not identified. It may be a new species or even a new genus, and it was the last thing poor Batten ever collected. Oh, I don't like the look of it. It's such an ugly shape. I don't like those things that stick out. It looks like a spider shamming dead. It is certainly not a pretty lump of stuff, but it may turn out to be a very beautiful orchid indeed. They found poor Batten lying dead or dying in a mangrove swamp with one of these very orchids crushed up under his body. Every drop of blood was taken out of him by the jungle leeches. It may be that very plant that cost him his life to obtain. Oh, fancy dying away from every comfort in a nasty swamp, and just for people in England to have orchids. Just think, there has been a dead body lying across that ugly thing. The next few days he was strangely busy in his steamy little hothouse, fussing about with charcoal, lumps of teak, moss, and all the mysteries of the orchid cultivator. In the evening he would talk about these new orchids to his friends, and again he reverted to his expectation of something strange. Several of the Vanders and Dendrobium died under his care, but presently the strange orchid began to show signs of life. He was delighted and took his housekeeper to see it at once. That is a bud, and presently there will be a lot of leaves there, and those little things coming out here are aerial rootlets. Oh, they look to me like little white fingers poking out of the brown, fingers trying to get at you. It's silly of me, but I can't help thinking of that corpse. I don't like them. Wedderburn felt a little hurt at her dislike of the plant, but that did not prevent his talking to her about it whenever he felt inclined. There are such queer things about orchids, such possibilities of surprises. Very likely my orchid may be something extraordinary. The leaves are beginning to unfold now. I wish you would come and see them. But she said she had seen the plant once again, and the aerial rootlets, which now seemed, some of them more than a foot long, had reminded her of tentacles reaching out after something. Wedderburn would have to admire his leaves alone. They were of a deep, glossy green with splashes of deep red towards the base. And at last, the great thing happened. As he entered the little glass house, he knew that the spike had burst out. There was a new odor in the air, a rich, intensely sweet scent that overpowered every other in the crowded, steaming little greenhouse. He hurried to the strange orchid, whose trailing green spikes bore now 3 great splashes of blossom from which the overpowering sweetness proceeded. The flowers were white, with streaks of golden orange upon the petals. The heavy labellum was coiled into an intricate projection, and a wonderful bluish purple mingled there with the gold. He could see at once that the genus was altogether a new one, and the insufferable scent. How hot the place was! The blossoms swam before his eyes. Suddenly, everything appeared unsteady. The bricks on the floor were dancing up and down. Then the white blossoms, the green leaves behind them, the whole greenhouse seemed to sweep sideways and then in a curve upward. At 4:30, his cousin made the tea, according to their invariable custom. But Wedderburn did not come in. "He's worshipping that horrid Orchid. I will go and call him." She went straight to the hothouse, and opening the door, called his name. There was no reply. She noticed that the air was very close and loaded with an intense perfume. Then she saw something lying on the bricks between the hot water pipes. He was lying face upward at the foot of the strange orchid. The tentacle-like aerial rootlets no longer swayed freely in the air, but were crowded together, a tangle of grey ropes, and stretched tight with their ends closely applied to his chin and neck and hands. Then she saw from under one of the exultant tentacles upon his cheek there trickled a little thread of blood. With an inarticulate cry, she ran towards him and tried to pull him away from the leech-like suckers. She snapped two of the tentacles, and their sap dripped red. Then the overpowering scent of the blossom began to make her head reel. She felt she was fainting, knew she must not. She caught up a flower pot and smashed it in the windows at the end of the greenhouse. She tugged at Wedderburn's motionless body and brought the strange orchid crashing to the floor. It still clung with the grimmest tenacity to its victim. In a frenzy, she lugged it and him into the open air. Then she thought of tearing through the sucker rootlets one by one, and in another minute she had released him and was dragging him with red-stained hands away from the horror. Weeping with excitement, and with Wedderburn's head upon her knee, she wiped the blood from his face. "What's the matter?" said Wedderburn, opening his eyes feebly. "You fainted in the hothouse." "And the orchid? I will see to that." Wedderburn had lost a good deal of blood, but beyond that he had suffered no very great injury. The next morning the strange orchid still lay there, black now and putrescent. The hothouse door banged intermittently in the morning breeze, and all the array of Wedderburn's orchids was shriveled and prostrate. But Wedderburn himself was bright and garrulous upstairs in the glory of his strange adventure.
The Little Room by Madeline Yale Wynne. How would it do for a smoking room? Just the very place. Only, you know, Roger, you must not think of smoking in the farmhouse. I'm almost afraid that having just a plain, common man around, well, let alone a smoking man, will upset Aunt Hannah. She is New England, Vermont New England, boiled down. Now tell me again exactly what to expect. It's something queer that happened when you were a child, wasn't it? Oh, something that began to happen long before that and kept happening and may happen again, but I hope not. The Little Room, then. Well, Mother was born in Vermont. She was the only child by a second marriage. Aunt Hannah and Aunt Maria were her half-sisters. They brought Mother up and were nearly 20 years older than she. How old are they? 70 or thereabouts, but they will die standing, or at least on a Saturday night after all the housework is done up. They were rather strict with Mother, and I think she had a lonely childhood in that bleak, remote farmhouse. When Mama was about 10 years old, they sent her to Brooklyn to some cousins who knew more about bringing up children. She stayed in Brooklyn till she married. Then she and Father took their wedding trip back in Vermont. When they got to the farmhouse, Mother wanted to take Father right off into the little room that she had previously described to him in great detail. She said that of all the rooms, that was the only one that seemed pleasant to her. Well, when they went to look for it, there was no little room there. There was only a a shallow china closet. She asked her sisters when the house had been altered, and they both said the house was exactly as it had been built, that they had never made any changes. Father and Mother laughed a good deal over it and finally concluded that my mother had been a very imaginative sort of a child and had made believe till she herself had really thought the room was there. When I was 8 years old, my father was killed in the war, and Mother was broken-hearted. She never quite got strong afterwards, and that summer we decided to go up to the farm for 3 months. To pass the long journey, Mama told me the story of the little room and how it was all in her own imagination and how there was really only a china closet there. She told it with all the particulars, and even to me, it seemed just as real as could be. She said it was on the north side, and it was very small. Directly opposite the door was a lounge that was covered with blue-stamped chintz and with a peacock on it. And they had decided that Mother had imagined it all, and yet you see how exactly everything was painted in her mind. And all this never existed except in her imagination. Wasn't there any blue chintz in the house with a peacock figure? Not a scrap. Aunt Hannah said there had never been any such that she could remember. You see, Aunt Hannah is an up-and-down New England woman. Her joints move up and down and backward and forward in a plain square sort of fashion. I don't believe she ever leaned on anything in her life or sat in an easy chair. But Maria is rounder and softer, and she hasn't any ideas of her own. When Mama and I got there, of course, I was all excitement to see the china closet, and I had a sort of a feeling that it would be the little room after all. So I ran ahead and threw open the door, crying, "Come and see the little room!" And Roger, there really was a little room there. There was the lounge and the peacock chintz, everything exactly as she had described it to me. I ran out exclaiming, "The room is here!" It seemed for a minute as if my mother would faint. I can remember how pale she was. I called out to Aunt Hannah and asked her when they had had the closet taken away and the little room built. "That little room has always been there ever since the house was built." "But Mama said there wasn't any little room here, only a china closet when she was here with Papa." No, there has never been any china closet there. It's always been just as it is now," Maria echoed without the slightest emotion. "The house has never been altered. Your Mama used to play in this room when she was a child." How cold their gray eyes were. Mother was in an agony of perplexity. Over the months, she grew pale and thin and had a little cough, and, she never got well and died that autumn. Roger, do you know I almost hate to go there after talking about it? I somehow feel as if it might, be a china closet again. Oh, boy, that's absurd. Well, I know it, of course. It can't be. I saw the room, and there isn't any china closet there, and no gilt-edged china in the house either. It was dusk when Mr. and Mrs. Grant walked up the narrow path to the door where they were met by the two aunts. Hannah gave Mrs. Grant a frigid kiss, and Maria then gave her greeting in exactly the same repressed way. Supper was waiting for them, and afterwards Margaret and her husband went to find a little room or closet or whatever was to be there, while the two aunts carefully washed the dishes. Hand in hand, they opened the door. It opened into a china closet. The shelves were neatly draped with scalloped paper. On them was the gilt-edged china. In disbelief, Margaret turned and shook the shelves. She reached her hand behind them and tried to push the boards away. She ran into the kitchen and begged the aunts to tell her about the little room. What had become of it? When had they built the closet? When had they bought the gilt-edged china? They went on washing dishes and drying them with methodical exactness, and as they worked, they said that there had never been any little room so far as they knew. The china closet had always been there. 5 years later, Mr. and Mrs. Grant were moving to Europe. They were not to be back in America for years. She had meant to go up to say goodbye to her aunts, but had not found time. Just before bed the night before their departure, Margaret said, "Roger, you remember Rita Lash? Well, she and Cousin Nan go up to the Adirondacks every autumn, and I have entrusted to them something I want done very much. You see, Roger, that little room, they are going to go up there and will write us about what they see." Rita Lash and Cousin Nan planned to go to Vermont on their way to the Adirondacks. They found they would have 3 hours between trains, which would give them time to drive up to the Keys farm. But at the last minute, Rita was prevented from going. Nan went on ahead, and she promised to telegraph Rita when she arrived at the camp. Imagine Rita's amusement when she received this message. "Safely arrived, went to the farm. It is a little room." Rita did not in the least think Nan had been there. She thought it was a hoax, but it put it into her mind to carry the joke further by really visiting the aunts when she went up to the Adirondacks the next week. They were, if not cordial, at least not disconcerted by her visit, and willingly showed her over the house. As they did not speak of any other strangers having been to see them lately, she became confirmed in her belief that Nan had not been there. In the north room, she saw the door that opened into a china closet. Satisfied, she went on that night into the camp. When Nan and she were alone in their room, she coaxed, "By the way, Nan, what did you see at the farmhouse, and how did you like Martha and Hannah?" Nan began excitedly to tell her all about her visit. Rita could almost have believed Nan, enjoying the impressive way in which she described her opening the door and finding the little room, if she'd not been certain Nan had never been there. Then Rita said, "Now, Nan, that is enough fibbing. I went to the farm myself on my way up yesterday, and there is no little room, and there never has been any. It is a china closet, just as Mrs. Grant saw it last." Then Nan broke in, "But I went myself, and you did not go. You can't have been there, for it is a little room." Well, they talked and argued, and both maintained that they had been there, but both felt sure the other one was either crazy or obstinate beyond reason. The next morning, Rita said, "Nan, pack your satchel. We can catch the afternoon express train, and we will go together to the farm." Nan didn't say a word, but packed up her belongings. At the little junction in Vermont, they found a farmer with a wagon full of meal bags. They asked if he could take them up to the old Keys farm and bring them back in time for the return train. They had planned to call it a sketching trip, so they said, "We have been here before. We are artists, and we might find some views worth taking, and we want to make a short call upon the Mrs. Keys." "Did you calculate to paint the old house in the picture?" They said it was possible they might do so. They wanted to see it anyway. "Well, I guess you're too late. The house burnt down last night, and everything in it."
I am Mary Shelley.
Yo soy Mary Shelley.
Frankenstein. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet.
Una desapacible noche de noviembre, contemplé el fin de mis esfuerzos. Coloqué los instrumentos que me iban a permitir infundir un hálito de vida a la cosa inerte que yacía a mis pies.
It was already 1 in the morning.
Era ya la 1 de la madrugada.
The rain pattered dismally against the panes,
La lluvia golpeaba las ventanas sombríamente.
and my candle was nearly burnt out.
La vela casi consumida.
When I saw,
Cuando yo vi,
by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, the dull yellow eye of the creature open.
los ojos amarillentos y apagados de la criatura.
It breathed hard.
Respiró profundamente.
and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs.
Y un movimiento convulsivo sacudió su cuerpo.
How?
¿Cómo?
How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form?
¿Cómo expresar mi sensación ante esta catástrofe? ¿O describir el engendro que con tanto esfuerzo e infinito trabajo había creado?
How?
¿Cómo?
His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful.
Sus miembros estaban bien proporcionadas y había seleccionado sus rasgos por hermosos.
Beautiful.
Hermosos.
Great God!
¡Santo cielo!
His yellow skin
Su piel amarillenta
scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath.
apenas ocultaba el entramado de músculos y arterias.
His hair
Su pelo,
was of a lustrous black and flowing.
negro, largo y lustroso.
His teeth
Los dientes,
of a pearly whiteness.
blanquísimos.
But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with the watery eyes that seemed almost the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set.
No hacía más que resaltar el horrible contraste con sus ojos acuosos,
His shriveled complexion
el rostro arrugado
and his straight black
y
lips.
sus finos y negruzcos labios.
I beheld the wretch,
Vi al engendro,
the miserable monster whom I had created.
al monstruo miserable que había creado.
He held up the curtain of the bed,
Tenía levantada la cortina de la cama
and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me.
y sus ojos me miraban fijamente.
His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear.
Abrió la mandíbula y murmuró unos sonidos ininteligibles, a la vez que una mueca arrugaba sus mejillas. Puede que hablara, pero yo no lo oí.
One hand was stretched out to detain me,
Tendía hacia mí una mano,
but I escaped and rushed downstairs.
pero me precipité escaleras abajo.
Oh, why? No mortal could support the horror of that countenance. A mummy, again endued with animation, could not be so hideous as that wretch.
Ningún mortal podría soportar el horror que inspiraba aquel rostro. Ni una momia reanimada podría ser tan espantosa como aquel engendro.
I had gazed upon him while unfinished.
Yo lo había observado cuando aún estaba incompleto.
He was ugly then.
Ya entonces era repugnante.
But when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became a thing such as even Dante could not have conceived.
Pero cuando sus músculos y articulaciones tuvieron movimiento, se convirtió en algo que ni siquiera Dante hubiera podido concebir.
I felt the bitterness of disappointment.
Sentía la amargura de la desilusión.
Dreams
Sueños
that had been my food and pleasant rest for so long a space were now become a hell to me.
Los sueños
Dreams
que durante tanto tiempo habían constituido mi sustento y descanso se me convertían ahora en un infierno.
and the change was so rapid, the overflow so complete.
Y el cambio era tan brusco, tan total.
Morning, dismal and wet at length dawned.
Por fin llegó el amanecer, gris y lluvioso.
I issued out into the streets, pacing them with quick steps, as if I sought to avoid the wretch whom I feared every turning of the street would present to my view.
Salí fuera, cruzando las calles como si quisiera evitar el monstruo que temía ver aparecer al doblar cada esquina.
I did not dare return to my apartment, but felt impelled to hurry on.
Seguí adelante bajo un cielo oscuro e inhóspito.
Drenched by the rain which poured from a black and comfortless sky. I traversed the streets.
Recorrí las calles,
without any clear conception of where I was or what I was doing.
sin conciencia clara de dónde estaba o de lo que hacía.
My heart palpitated in the sickness of fear,
El corazón me palpitaba con la angustia del temor.
and I hurried on with irregular steps, not daring to look about me,
Sin osar mirar hacia atrás,
like one who, on a lonely road,
como alguien que en un solitario camino
doth walk in fear and dread,
avanza con miedo y terror,
and having once turned round, walks on,
continúa.
and no more turns his head,
Y habiéndose vuelto una vez, continúa.
walks on, because he knows
Sabe que
a frightful fiend
un terrible enemigo
doth close behind him tread.
está cerca detrás.
The end.
Fin.
The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. I rode on a horse one dull, dark, and soundless day in autumn, until I came upon the melancholy House of Usher. I do not know why, but I felt an intolerable gloom. I say intolerable because there was nothing poetic or beautiful about this scene, only the dreary house on the edge of a cliff, over a black lake surrounded by dead and rotting trees. Still, I was planning to spend some weeks here. Its owner, Roderick Usher, had been one of my closest childhood friends, even though I had not seen him for many years. However, he had sent me a letter. He hoped that my company would make him feel better, so I had to come. I had learned a very remarkable fact, that the entire Usher family lay in the direct line of descent, and that the peasants of that region called both the family itself and the family mansion the House of Usher. The house itself was incredibly old, and it was greatly discolored by time. The building did not look unstable. However, if you looked very carefully, you could see a very thin crack. It ran from the roof of the building in the front and made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the dark waters of the lake. After observing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant took my horse, and a valet led me to the studio of his master through many dark and intricate passages. I felt an increasing gloom as we walked. Finally, the valet opened the door of the studio. It was very large and high. There were many pieces of furniture, but they were all comfortless, antique, tattered. An air of deep and hopeless gloom hung over and pervaded all. When I came in, Roderick Usher got up from a sofa and greeted me warmly. We then sat down, and for some moments, while he did not speak, I looked at him with pity and fear. I could hardly believe that he was the same person who had been my boyhood friend. The ghastly pallor of his skin and the miraculous shine of his eyes shocked me and even frightened me. He said that it was a constitutional and family evil, and that he did not think he would find a cure. He suffered from an extreme acuteness of the senses. He could only endure the most insipid food. He could wear only clothing of a certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there were only a few special sounds which did not inspire him with horror. He admitted that much of his sadness came from the long illness and the approaching death of his beloved sister. Her death, he said,
would make me the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. While he spoke, his sister, the Lady Madeline, walked slowly through the other end of the studio and, without seeing me, disappeared. None of Madeline's doctors had been able to help her. She had suffered from apathy, a gradual wasting away of her person, and frequent attacks of catalepsy, and I learned that the glimpse I had of her would probably be my last. For the next few days, we did not mention her name, and during this time I tried to make my friend feel better. We painted and read together, or I listened as if in a dream to the wild improvisations of his playing the guitar. He believed that the home of his ancestors was somehow alive. The result of this could be seen in the silent, persistent, and terrible influence which for centuries had shaped the destinies of his family and which made him what I now saw. One evening, Usher told me that Madeline had died. He was going to keep her body in a family vault for 2 weeks before burying her in the family cemetery. He had decided to do this because of the strange nature of his sister's disease, his distrust of her doctors, and the great distance of the cemetery. So I helped Usher with this temporary burial of his sister in the family vault, which was deep underground, directly below my bedroom. When we had placed the coffin in the vault, we lifted up the lid to look at her face. The first thing I noticed was the great similarity between the brother and sister. Guessing my thoughts, he told me that he and the deceased had been twins, and that there had always been a strange understanding between them. Several days later, I began to see a great change in my friend. He no longer read, painted, or played music. His voice shook when he spoke, as if from extreme terror. At times, I thought that my friend was fighting to tell me some oppressive secret. Other times I thought that he was just mad because he stared into space for hours as if he were listening to some imaginary sound. Then on the 7th or 8th night after placing Madeline in the vault, I felt the full power of these feelings. It was stormy outside and I could not sleep. For some strange reason, I began to pay attention to some low and indistinct sounds. I could not stand it anymore and began to walk back and forth in my room. A few minutes later, Usher entered my room holding a lamp. He was as pale as usual, but now there was a kind of mad laughter in his eyes. "And haven't you seen it?" he said suddenly, after having stared at me for a few moments in silence. "You have not seen it? Oh, but wait, you will." Then he hurried to one of the windows and opened it to the storm outside. The wind entered the room and nearly lifted us from our feet. It was a windy night of singular terror and beauty. "You will not look at this," I said to Usher, and I led him with gentle violence from the window to a seat. So I picked up a book, Mad Tryst by Sir Launcelot Canning, and began to read it to Usher. I hoped that this would bring some relief. I then came to that well-known part of the story where Ethelred, the hero of the story, tries to break into the house of the evil hermit. Here, the story goes like this. "And now the courageous Ethelred began to break down the door with his stick. As he hit the door, the wood cracked apart, and the sound could be heard throughout the forest." At the end of this sentence, I started because I thought that I heard from some remote part of the mansion a sound just like the sound described in the book. Perhaps, though, it was just the sound of the wind, and so I continued the story. But Ethelred, when he finally entered, did not see the evil hermit. Instead, he saw a giant dragon with a fiery tongue that was guarding a palace of gold with a silver floor. On the wall, a shield hung on which was written, "Whoever enters here, a conqueror has been. Whoever kills the dragon, the shield shall win." And Ethelred lifted his stick and struck the head of the dragon, which died with such a horrible shriek that Ethelred had to cover his ears. Indeed, such dreadful noise had never been heard before. Here again I stopped suddenly. I was now certain that somewhere in the mansion the exact same shriek described by the novelist had been heard. My friend moved his chair so that he faced the door of the room, and now his body rocked slowly, side to side. I continued the story. "And now Ethelred, having killed the dragon, went to get the shield on the wall, but before he even put his hand on the shield, it fell with a terrible ringing sound.
As soon as I had said these words, I heard the same ringing and metallic sound in the house. Completely unnerved, I jumped to my feet, but Usher continued rocking gently in his chair. I rushed to the chair and he stared in front of him. I put my hand on his shoulder and his whole body shook, and there was a horrible smile on his face. He spoke quickly and indistinctly. I bent over him and finally understood what he was saying. Don't you hear it? Yes, I hear it, and I have heard it long, many minutes, many hours, many days I have heard it, and yet I didn't dare to speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Didn't I tell you that my senses were acute? And now, tonight, no, we didn't hear those things. We heard the opening of the coffin, the sound of the door of her prison, and her fighting to escape from the vault. Where can she escape to? Isn't she hurrying here to scream at me for having buried her too soon? Can't I hear the horrible beating of her heart? At this point, he jumped up and shrieked, "Madman, I tell you that she now stands outside the door." As if the superhuman energy of his words was magical, the door opened. Outside the door there did stand Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood on her white clothing and signs of the terrible struggle to escape from the coffin on her thin body. For a moment she stood trembling, and then, in her violent and now final death agonies, fell heavily on her brother, pulling him to the floor, and in that moment he too died, a victim of the terrors he had anticipated. I ran from the room, terrified. The storm was still blowing with all its force, and I crossed the old causeway. Suddenly there was a flash of wild light. I turned around to see where it came from. The light was of the full and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that zigzag crack in the house which I described before. While I watched, this crack widened rapidly, and then the wind suddenly blew fiercely, and the entire moon suddenly appeared. I was amazed as I saw the mighty walls fall apart. Then there was a loud shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep lake below me closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher. The end.